Have you ever wondered how the rapidly evolving landscape of AI regulation and data privacy impacts not only our technology, but also our everyday lives? Now, today's episode of the Tech Talks Daily podcast is going to take a deep dive into this critical topic. I'm your host, Neil C. Hughes, and joining me today is Amy Worley, and she's a renowned expert in AI regulation and data privacy. And together, we're going to explore the intricacies of EU's new AI Act, the innovative AI Pact, and the complexities of data privacy regulation in the US, EU, and beyond. And also learn more about how staying informed is so critical in this ever-changing arena. But before we invite Amy onto the podcast, I wanted to give a quick shout out to Kiteworks, who are currently sponsoring the Tech Talks Daily podcast. And one of the reasons I've partnered with them is the realisation that legacy managed file transfer tools are becoming dated. They lack the security that today's remote workforce demands, and companies that continue relying on outdated technology are actually putting their sensitive data at risk. And that's just one of the many reasons that I've partnered with Kiteworks. So please step into the future of secure managed file transfer with Kiteworks. And you can do that by simply visiting kiteworks.com to get started. That's kiteworks.com to get started today. But now it's time to get Amy onto the podcast to talk about AI regulation and so much more. So buckle up and hold on tight as I beam your ears all the way to the US, where Amy is waiting to join us today. So a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell everyone listening a little about who you are and what you do?
Sure. Thanks, Neil. So I'm Amy Worley. I am a managing director at Berkeley Research Group, BRG. We are a multinational consulting firm. I am a recovering lawyer, so I still go to meetings, but I advise clients on international data privacy issues, data security compliance, and increasingly on AI governance, AI ethics, and AI regulation. So what I tell people at cocktail parties is if it's a rule about data, I probably know more about it than is fun to have an average conversation with you.
And I'm so glad to get you on the podcast today, because I think it's something that so many business leaders are terrified of at the moment. They're seeing AI taking over just about everything. They know if they sit on the sidelines that they could get left behind, but equally they know if they rush in and get it wrong with the increase of AI regulation and talk about ethics around AI, they could end up in a lot of trouble a few months down the line. So just to set the scene for our conversation today, are you able to offer a bit of an overview of the AI Act that was recently agreed upon by the European Union and what some of those key rules and regulations that we can possibly expect that will come into effect, not only here in the European Union and maybe similar rules in the US as well?
Yeah, so I would say first, don't be scared. This is new. It's exciting. I already am using AI in my practice to be more efficient. And so I'm very technology optimistic and tell people there's a lot of change coming, but that's just an opportunity for a lot of input. So don't be scared. The AI Act that was agreed to politically in December of 2023 is really the first big stage AI legislation coming out globally. China has some. There is legislation in development all over the world, but Brussels is leading on AI in the same way that it did on privacy. One of the things that I tell clients is the AI Act isn't actually going to apply to a lot of what we think of as AI. So it is risk-based. And the idea behind the act in the recitals is to create a law that encourages innovation, encourages research, and encourages us to improve human lives with AI. So this is not an anti-AI law. What it does do, though, is say we have some basic human values, some fundamental rights and freedoms in the EU, and for liberal democracies worldwide that we need to protect. And so it creates 4 categories of AI. Prohibited AI, and I always tell people the cheat sheet on that is sci-fi novel stuff. If it's going to be able to say how you feel or manipulate your feelings or unfairly or deceptively modify your behaviors, that's prohibited. And honestly, that's not new. We already had laws that said we don't unfairly compete. We don't unfairly deceive individuals. So we just made that explicit to AI. Then there's high risk systems. The European Commission has said right now they think that's 5 to 15% of the AI that's in development. And those systems have a lot of obligations, and we can talk about those in a little bit. But that's going to be your generative AI and your foundational models. Lots of folks, I enjoyed your conversation with Paula the other day. A lot of folks are starting to use ChatGPT or Bard or other AI tools to build their own tools. And so there's a lot of focus on those foundation systems. Are those safe, sound? That's where we're looking. Then there's minimal risk or low risk. And for those, there's really not much regulation. So that's kind of what we're looking at. The requirements are, we're going to be sure things are safe. So testing, assessing. The European model is built on the framework of product safety. So they took existing product safety laws and they said, well, this is another product that needs to be safe. And so clear testing, documentation, governance, quality monitoring what happens once it's deployed. And then a more recent development that we've seen as the text was leaked last week is that we're going to spread this across the development lifecycle. So it is going to be on the foundation models. They will have a piece of it, but so will the developers who are developing specific use cases. They will have a piece of those obligations, and so will the companies that deploy. So we're trying to share this burden and share this risk across the life cycle. So I'm really positive about it. The last thing I will mention is this is the first time in my career that I've seen as much international cooperation. They are Europe, the US, Canada, Saudi Arabia, and everyone is trying to work from a common set of definitions and a common set of values. I say all the time, the data doesn't care what country it's in. And so I'm very optimistic about this will be something where there are fairly uniform global standards in the near term.
And I'm curious, how do you see the AI Pact bridging the gap between some of that current AI regulation that we're seeing and the forthcoming AI Act? How do you see that playing out and that bridge and how that takes place? Any comments on this?
Yeah, so I think it's a brilliant idea. So we're going to get the companies who are really at the forefront of this and start working with the commission to really get specific on if we put these tests in place, do these tests meet your standards? Have a conversation and share common knowledge so that as guidance comes out, as we start getting trained on how to implement these AI Act, it'll be based on real life use cases. So I think OpenAI, Microsoft, and others who are really forward in this space are going to raise their hand and say, let's do a practice run. And that will help everybody get this right.
And of course, we are living at a time where global tensions are quite high, and we're starting to question, quite rightly, where data exists. And I think the TikTok example recently is a great example of that, of people are suddenly trying to wake up to where is my data being saved and which countries does it go through. So from your extensive experience as a data globetrotter, which is a great line, I mean, how do you see data sharing evolving across borders, particularly with this new AI Act? Because it's a big talking point now, isn't it?
It is. And we start hearing things like data sovereignty. And when I'm being cynical, I will say we don't have the ability to do data sovereignty. I think that we can try to do localization with keeping data on servers in specific countries, but the data doesn't care where it is. And with networks like Tor, an anonymous browser that you can move data around the world without attribution, localization becomes really hard. So what I'm really interested in is improving people's understanding of this so that they can make choices. And where we're starting to see in the privacy space and in the AI space is much more of a push to be very transparent with people about this is the data we're collecting, and this is where we're sharing it, and this is how we're going to use it. And common users are starting to understand what that means for them. I'm going to make a plug for a fairly new book called Privacy is Power. It's by a woman named Carissa Valise, and she teaches at Oxford, but it's written for the average reader to really start understanding about these data collection practices of companies, whether it's TikTok or even your e-commerce platforms. And what does that mean for your personal power? What does that mean for collective power? What does that mean for democracies? And I think we're going to start seeing, again, much more of a push toward almost radical transparency. The FTC recently came out in the US and said, you companies are not being direct and clear enough about your data collection practices. And that's unfair because people will then consent and they don't really understand what they're consenting.
And you mentioned a few moments ago that you are a tech optimist, but I suspect, like all of us, you do spend a little time doom scrolling down your newsfeed, seeing nothing but negative information, maybe coming across a fair amount of myths and misconceptions. So to set some of that straight, what are some of the critical aspects of AI and data privacy that the media might be overlooking in their coverage? Is there anything that you're seeing here or you're not seeing here, should I say?
Sure. So I still think right now we have a little bit of domain fighting over AI. Who are the experts? Are they the technical experts or are they the compliance experts? And my answer to all that is yes, it's all of them. And so I would love to see a lot more cross expertise conversation about this. So from the business side, how are we going to use this to add value to people's lives? From the technical side, what does the average person need to understand about syntax and how large language models work? And then on the sort of civic side of how can this data be manipulated to drive outcomes that really do affect vulnerable populations or, affect everybody. I do get concerned about large scale data collection and using that to target advertising for political purposes, using that for like what we call dark patterns in privacy, trying to get people to make choices using their data kind of against them. So I don't see enough discussion of that. And also data brokers. In the US, we have massive data brokers who have taken this period where there was not a lot of regulation and scraped and gathered massive amounts of information on people that they can then sell. And I think a lot of folks are not as aware as maybe they should be about who's buying that data and why.
And in your view, why do you think legislation around things like data privacy is stalling? Are there any complexities that regulators might be missing in this domain? Anything you're seeing here?
Man, that's a conversation we could have at a pub for many hours. Yeah. But I do think in the US, so the reason we're having trouble in the US is we have sort of two different models. We have what I would say, to make it in EU terms, like the directive model. We're going to establish a floor and the states can then do something more restrictive, or the regulation model. And right now, the Democrats tend to support the regulation model. The Republicans tend to support more the directive model. We're super divided right now. And that division means that it's hard to get stuff through Congress. And so in the gap, we're seeing a lot of states filling in, and we're seeing a lot of U.S. regulators filling in. So I am not optimistic that we will have a U.S. federal privacy law until after the next election. And obviously, whether we get one then depends on who wins. To quote President Obama, elections matter. So we'll see. I also think that until recently, there wasn't a lot of understanding on the Hill of why this matters. There was in the U.S. a history of thinking about PII, which is a very small subset of data, personally identifiable information, and identity theft and the financial consequences of having your identity stolen. It wasn't until we started really seeing social media and the full ramifications of social media and effects on children and mental health until we saw things like Cambridge Analytica and ideas about election interference, that legislators really started to understand this is not your mother's privacy. We're in a different place and we need different standards for it. So, and there's a lot of folks, I'll never forget when Mark Zuckerberg was on the Hill and they were like, well, how do you make money? And he's like, sir, we sell ads. And I was just like, oh my gosh, yes, they sell behavioral ads. And if you don't know that, how can you legislate this?
Yeah. And you mentioned the divide there in the US. It's exactly the same on this side of the pond, especially with individual countries within the EU, all having different unique approaches to data. So how do you see this divide and these different approaches impacting the implementation of something like the AI Act?
So, yeah, I spend a lot of time on your side of the pond too. And I definitely, I'm always telling people it's the same. People are divided right now. I'm optimistic about the AI Act, but for a somewhat cynical reason, which is the European Commission elections are in the fall.
Yeah.
And I don't see a lot of member countries voting no on an act that's so popular. So I think that it will come into force, and where we will start to see the same thing that we have with the GDPR is how are the countries themselves going to set up their regulatory enforcement? And are we going to get in data privacy, we have the Ireland versus Germany sort of difference there. Are we going to see that in AI as well? And I think probably. And then the mechanisms that are in the law to align and harmonize will come into play. So there will be uncertainty and there will be forum shopping. People will decide what regulator they want. And then we'll start to see, what does this look like once we actually start doing it?
And ironically, as you're spending time on this side of the pond, I'm spending a lot of time in the US for tech conferences and things and covering those. And one of the things that I read recently was that Florida, I think it was, became the 10th state with a data privacy law. I mean, what trends are you observing in this state-level data privacy legislation in the US? And do you think that could influence federal policy eventually?
Maybe. I will say I looked it up today and we're at 14 states.
Wow, okay.
So, and there are several more in the oven. So, what is hard about that? And I've been dealing with the patchwork of U.S. laws since there were U.S. laws on this. They are not all aligned. So they are generally aligned in that they are giving individuals the same rights that you would see under the GDPR. In the U.S., there's a lot more concern about, again, sharing and selling data and having consent to do that. So making sure that if you are sharing data for especially behavioral advertising, that you have a mechanism in place to give meaningful choice on that. But like Tennessee's law, which I love, just came out and said, if you voluntarily implement a privacy program, almost a GDPR type privacy program with privacy impact assessments and consumer rights, that can be an affirmative defense to liability for a privacy violation. So we're starting to see some carrots in the legislation of, if you will build these programs, which we know are expensive, we will give you some liability protection on the back end.
And if we also reflect on the recent senator's warning to Twitter and Elon Musk over the alleged data privacy concerns there, do you think that signals anything about the current state and equally the future direction of data privacy regulation across the tech industry? It seems there's a lot going on here, almost a bit of momentum building.
And it's actually one of the few bipartisan issues, really. Yeah. So Senator Blumenthal, Senator Hawley, there are a couple others, but that gives you a Democrat and a Republican, are very focused on this right now. Yeah. We saw the letter to Elon Musk saying, tell us what personal data you are tracking in Teslas. And they're looking into that. I think it was yesterday, or it might have been the day before, when I get in the work week, it starts to blend. We had tech leaders on the Hill in hearings about how they're handling children's data. And those were bipartisan and really tough questions about how are you making sure that you are following the rules about age gating? And what are you doing about cyberbullying and trafficking? And those types of protecting children online, everybody agrees with that. And so I think we might see some federal coming together on that piece. Like, okay, we all agree we're going to protect children. And so it's possible that we'll see something there. But also the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, has been very active. Director Khan has been really active, and she is also very focused on children's data and on data brokers and things like location data. We've had a couple FTC decisions lately saying you can't sell this micro level location data. Amy Worley is sitting on Creedmoor Road in Raleigh without her full knowledge and express consent to do that. And so, and there's more going on in this space than there ever has been in the past. So my tagline on LinkedIn is the first rule of privacy is that the last rule of privacy just changed. And I don't see that changing anytime soon.
It sounds like by the time this podcast goes live, it'll be out of date already. So we will get you back on towards the end of the year for a bit of an update on this and see how things are continuously evolving. But before I let you go, I think for everybody listening, wherever they are in the world, there's this real pressure on everyone to be in this state of continuous learning. So a question I've got to ask is, where or how do you self-educate to keep on top of these trends and on top of these changes that are continuously moving?
It is. So I actually devote a specific time on Friday to read because there are so many changes. I really recommend the International Association of Privacy Professionals website. They have a lot of free resources, and they have an AI dashboard as well. So it's not just privacy laws, but it's also AI governance. I stay up on tech news. I read Wired. I read the tech sections of the newspapers every day. And then there's a lot of really good books coming out. So I mentioned Belize's book earlier. There are a couple others that I actually made a note of so that I wouldn't forget, because I was like, I'm going to forget my books. So The Age of AI, which was Henry Kissinger's last book, actually. So he wrote it with Eric Schmidt and a gentleman named Huttenlocker, and it's great. It's a really good look at how transformative this period is going to be. On the biometric side, so facial recognition, there's Your Face Belongs to Us by Kashmir Hill. I recommend that people take a look at that. We're dealing right now, there was a recent case in France about scraping the internet for photos of people and then putting that in an app that allows you to identify folks in real time based on facial recognition. And there are surveillance components to that. So it can be, the techno optimist says this is great at events like the Super Bowl and things to keep us safe. The student of history says, I don't want to live in a surveillance state. So balancing that. And then my favorite general AI book is The Atlas of AI. It really goes into all of AI, from the alignment problems to the energy challenges around how much compute power it takes, to are we exploiting people when we're training data sets, and how much are people getting paid to sit and train data sets, and questions of what happens to art now. So I think you have to make time for it and just be curious. And also, a lot of times, something will be so new that a client calls and says, I need help. And I say, give me some reading time. I'm going to have to sit and think about this for a little bit.
Wow. I'm going to add all of those books to the Amazon wish list that we've got for everybody listening so people can check those out. And at the end of our conversation, I must admit, you've sparked my curiosity with the book, Your Face Belongs to Us. So I'm going to be checking that out. But anyone listening just wants to find out more information about you, your work, contact your team, ask any questions. Where would you like to point everyone listening today to find out more information?
Sure. So I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. So following Amy Worley on LinkedIn, we have a website, Think Like With Your Brain, thinkbrg.com. So you can find out about our practice there. I do have a whole team who works globally across languages, across jurisdictions. So we have recently started working in Rwanda and Uganda, and it's really been just amazing to watch this develop globally. So happy to chat with anybody anytime.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining me on this show today. We've talked about so much there, from what rules to expect when the AI goes into effect, and also how the AI Pact will bridge the gap between now and then, and data privacy and everything in between, and even had time to leave us with 3 great books, one of which I'm going to be checking out shortly. But more than anything, just thank you so much for joining me today. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed it. Let's talk again at the end of the year.
Now, as we wrap up today's insightful conversation with Amy, I think it's clear that the landscape of AI regulation and data privacy is as complex as it is fascinating. And we've delved into the nuances of the EU AI Act and the impact on innovation and human rights, the collaborative opportunities presented by the AI Pact. But also, I think it's important to highlight the challenges faced in US data privacy regulation and the importance of staying informed in this rapidly evolving field. And I think Amy's recommendations and resources also provide a pathway to help us deepen our understanding. But what do you think? How do you see these regulations shaping the future of AI and indeed data privacy in your life, in your business, and indeed this entire world that we all share? So please let me know your thoughts and join the conversation. Email me, techblogwriter@outlook.com, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, just @NeilC.Hughes. And I also invite you to keep exploring this intersection of technology and our daily lives here on Tech Talks Daily, where I'll return again tomorrow with another guest. Hopefully you'll join me again bright and early tomorrow, but I'll leave you with a little question. Are you ready for the future that AI regulation and data privacy laws are shaping for us? Again, let me know your thoughts on that. Other than that, I'll see you bright and early tomorrow.